In 2014, a Japanese whiskey was named best in the world. Not a single Scottish whiskey made the top 5. For the first time in 12 years, Scotland had been humiliated. But Japan didn't steal Scotch whiskey's crown. Scotland had taught Japan everything they knew about whiskey, then got bought out by them. The student had become the master, and now Scotland was learning from its own apprentice. This is how Japan took over the Scotch whiskey industry and saved it from the brink of collapse. By 1983, Scotland was drowning. The industry had produced so much whiskey that the surplus could literally fill a lake. They named it the Whisky Loch. Warehouses packed floor to ceiling with barrels nobody wanted. The global economy had collapsed after the oil crisis. Inflation hit 25%, and production costs went through the roof. Meanwhile, American drinkers were switching to vodka and white rum. The market for Scotch had evaporated, so the distilleries started closing. In 1983 alone, the Distillers Company shuttered 9 malt distilleries and 1 grain distillery. 2 years later, 10 more went dark. Port Ellen, Brora, Banff, Glenmore, Glenugie, historic names that had survived wars and depressions were simply abandoned. Workers threw farewell parties in empty warehouses, handing out leftover bottles to local pensioners. Legend has it that one crew even discovered a 60-year-old cask while clearing out the stock. The industry called it terminal decline. That's the polite term. The reality was grimmer. Malt whiskey output crashed from over 200 million liters in 1978 to 93 million liters in 1983, the lowest level in 20 years. The Distillers Company launched something called the Dam Busters Plan. Desperate to liquidate the loch, they dumped high-quality single malt into cheap supermarket blends. Premium whiskey became bottom-shelf garbage. The public started seeing Scotch as a low-value commodity instead of a craft spirit. By the mid-80s, Scotland had lost faith in its own product. Boardrooms at the big distillers were shifting investment away from whiskey entirely. The future looked bleak. Many thought Scotch was finished. But 70 years before the crisis, one man had been taking notes, and those notes would eventually expose Scotland's greatest mistake. Masataka Taketsuru left Japan for Scotland back in 1918. He was the son of a sake brewer from Hiroshima, sent on a mission to learn the secrets of whiskey making. Japan wanted to create its own whiskey industry, and Taketsuru was going to bring back the blueprint. He enrolled at Glasgow University to study organic chemistry, but the real education happened in the distilleries. Over the next 2 years, he worked 3 apprenticeships. Longmorn in Speyside taught him malt production. James Calder showed him the coffee grain process for blending. Hazelburn and Campbelltown gave him the heavy, oily malts the region was famous for. At each stop, Taketsuru filled notebooks with meticulous drawings of pot stills, fermentation temperature logs, and detailed techniques for every stage of production. The Taketsuru notebooks became sacred texts. He documented everything: coal-fired stills, floor malting, diverse yeast cultivation. These were the methods Scotland would later abandon in favor of industrial efficiency. But Taketsuru captured them at their peak. He also married a Scottish woman named Rita Cowan. Rita would become known as the mother of Japanese whiskey. She attracted the investors who eventually funded the founding of the Yoichi distillery in Hokkaido. Taketsuru chose that location specifically because it mirrored the Scottish Highlands. It was cool, damp, and coastal. He believed the environment itself shaped the spirit. In 1929, Taketsuru's employer Suntory released Japan's first whiskey. They called it Scotch whiskey and put an English label on the bottle. The Distillers Company in Scotland was outraged. They saw Taketsuru's apprenticeships for what they were: industrial espionage. They tried to invoke government regulations to ban the product's distribution. They were furious that Japan had stolen their craft. But the whiskey failed anyway. Japanese consumers found it too smoky, too peated, too burnt. Taketsuru had made it purely Scottish, and the Japanese palate, accustomed to delicate sake, hated it. This failure caused a split. Suntory's founder wanted to adapt the whiskey to Japanese tastes, focusing on smoothness and floral notes. Taketsuru wanted to double down on traditional Highland styles. So Taketsuru left and founded his own company, Nikka. 2 rivals were born. Suntory became known for elegant, blended mastery. Nikka focused on rugged, traditional malts. By the 1950s, both companies were producing quality whiskey, and Scotland was watching nervously. As late as 1982, over 60 years after Taketsuru's visit, the Distillers Company was still debating whether to allow uninvited Japanese visitors into their distilleries. They'd built an extreme culture of secrecy, stung by what they saw as betrayal. They didn't trust the Japanese. But while Scotland was building walls, they were about to make a deal that would completely destroy them. By the 1970s, Japan's whiskey industry was booming. Domestic demand was exploding thanks to the mizuwari, a highball mixing whiskey with cold water and ice. But Japanese distillers didn't have enough aged stock to keep up. Their ambition exceeded their inventory. They needed mature whiskey, and they needed it fast. Scotland had the opposite problem. They needed to liquidate, and they needed cash flow. So, they made a deal. Scotland would sell bulk whiskey to Japan by the millions of gallons. In 1978 alone, Scotland exported 6 million gallons of bulk malt to Japan. Not in bottles, but in tankers. Raw spirit that Japanese firms could blend, age, and bottle however they wanted. The trade exploded through the 70s and early 80s. Scotland was dumping the lock straight into Japan's warehouses. Scotland chose cash over the future. The logic was simple. They were drowning, and they needed a temporary fix to survive the crisis. Japan was offering them a lifeline. No one actually believed Japan could ever challenge Scotland's whiskey. But here's what Japan did with that whiskey. They blended Scottish malt into their products and sold them as Japanese whiskey. Suntory Old, at one point the best-selling whiskey in the world, contained up to 20% Scottish malt. This was completely legal. Japan had no regulations defining what Japanese whiskey actually meant. A bottle could be 100% Scottish spirit, bottled in Japan and sold as Japanese. By the early 2000s, bulk exports had dropped to almost nothing as Japan's own aged stock matured. Japan had established itself as a serious whiskey producer, and they'd done it with Scotland's help. The student had become the rival, and Scotland had paid for the education. By 1989, Scotland was on life support. The Whisky Loch had destroyed balance sheets across the industry. Distilleries that survived the 80s were limping along, underfunded and overexposed. Many iconic brands were facing permanent closure or demolition. And that's when Japan started buying up. In 1989, Nikka purchased the Ben Nevis distillery in Fort William. Ben Nevis had been silent since 1986, a victim of the recession and oversupply crisis. Without Nikka's intervention, it would have been demolished like Banff or Glenugie. Nikka restarted production and saved the facility. They viewed Ben Nevis not just as a source of single malt for the UK market, but as a supplier of high-quality spirit for their Japanese blends. That same year, Suntory moved into Scotland. They'd already bought a stake in Macallan back in '86, but in '89 they acquired Morrison Bowmore, which included Bowmore, Auchentoshan, and Glen Garioch. Eventually, they took full ownership. But here's the thing. Japan didn't buy these distilleries out of charity. They bought them because they were undervalued assets with centuries of heritage. Scotland was selling at rock-bottom prices during the crisis, and Japan had the cash. It was a brilliant investment, and it gave Japan control over some of Scotland's most respected names. By the early 2000s, Japanese companies had quietly positioned themselves as major players in the Scotch industry. They owned distilleries, controlled brands, and had access to Scotland's aged stock. The relationship had flipped, but the real humiliation was still to come. Every year, whiskey expert Jim Murray publishes rankings of the world's best whiskeys. It's the most influential guide in the industry. Distilleries live and die by his scores, and in 2014, he dropped a bomb. He announced that the World Whiskey of the Year was Yamazaki Single Malt Sherry Cask 2013, giving it a score of 97.5 out of 100. Murray called it near incredible genius. He said it was a single malt which no Scotch can at the moment get anywhere near. He praised its boldness, its complexity, and its finish. It was, in his view, untouchable. And for the first time in 12 years, not a single Scottish whiskey made the top 5. The headlines were brutal. Humiliation for Scotland. A wake-up call for Scotch. Japan beats Scotland at its own game. The whiskey world was stunned. Scotch had always been the gold standard. The assumption was that authentic whiskey could only come from Scotland. Japan was just making imitations, everyone thought. Except Japan had just proven they weren't imitations anymore. They were superior. What set Japan apart was that they preserved the techniques Scotland had abandoned years earlier. While Scotland modernized for efficiency, Japan preserved what Taketsuru had documented in 1918. Take coal-fired stills, for example. Scotland switched to steam heating by the 70s. Easier to control, less labor, and consistent results. But coal firing creates hot spots at the base of the still. The wort scorches slightly, adding heavier, more complex notes. Nikka's Yoichi distillery never stopped using coal. When they started winning international awards, Scottish distillers had to admit the old way might be better. Or, regarding floor malting, Scotland moved to industrial facilities. But hand-turning barley on the distillery floor gives more control, and creates distinct flavors. Japan kept doing it, and when Suntory invested £6 million to restore Glengarioch in 2021, they reintroduced floor malting and direct-fired heating. A Japanese company teaching a Scottish distillery Scottish techniques. The irony is too good. Yeast had changed too. Scotland standardized strains to maximize yield. Suntory developed their own strain, called Suntoryieus, and used dozens of varieties for diverse flavors. Japan even innovated. During World War II, they were cut off from European oak, so they used Mizunara, a Japanese oak. It is porous, difficult, and leaks constantly. But after decades, it creates notes of sandalwood, incense, and coconut. Now Scottish distilleries also experiment with Mizunara finishes to compete. The student had become the teacher. But the Japanese whiskey that humiliated Scotland in 2014, it wasn't entirely Japanese. In April 2021, the Japan Spirits and Liqueurs Makers Association made a quiet announcement. They introduced new labeling standards. Anything called Japanese whiskey had to be fermented, distilled, and matured in Japan for at least 3 years. It had to be 100% Japanese. The reason? Decades of Japan passing Scottish imported whiskey as their own. Today, the relationship between Japan and Scotland is symbiotic, but the power dynamic is clear. In 2014, Suntory bought Beam Inc. for $16 billion. The acquisition created Beam Suntory, now rebranded as Suntory Global Spirits, the third largest premium spirits company in the world. The portfolio includes Japanese whiskeys like Yamazaki, Hibiki, and Hakushu, American bourbons like Jim Beam and Maker's Mark, and Scottish whiskeys like Laphroaig, Bowmore, Auchentoshan, Glengarioch, and Teachers. Suntory employs over 400 people in Scotland. The investment is real, but so is the control. Japanese whiskeys command significantly higher prices than Scotch. In 2024, Suntory raised prices on premium expressions by over 100%. Hibiki 30-year-old went from 160,000 yen to 360,000 yen, and those price increases pull Scottish single malts up with them. Collectors view Japanese and Scottish whiskies as part of the same elite category now. When Yamazaki's price doubles, Macallan's price rises too. Japan didn't just save Scotch whiskey. They repositioned it. They professionalized it. They turned it back into a luxury category after Scotland had nearly destroyed it by dumping premium stock into cheap blends. There's even talk of a second Whisky Loch. Export volumes are declining, overproduction is rising, and the global economy is unstable again. But this time, Japanese ownership provides the stability Scotland lacked in the 80s. Suntory isn't going to let their Scottish distilleries collapse. They're too valuable. The relationship isn't hostile. It's not even competitive anymore. It's consolidated. Japan maintains a firm presence in Scotland, and Scotland has accepted it. The irony is perfect. Japan used Scottish whiskey to build a reputation that beat Scotland, then bought Scottish distilleries with the profits. Scotland funded the rise, suffered the humiliation, then got bought out. You can't make this stuff up. For more stories about who controls what you drink, hit subscribe.